Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Really happy to have some of you along live, and I guess the rest of you will be watching the recording at some point at your own leisure. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all as well. So a quick roundup of a few technical aspects just before we get going. There we go. So yeah, just if although the microphones are muted at the moment, we can do any questions on the chat. That's probably the easiest option for us now. And if you're having some technical issues, then probably it makes sense to close down any other open programs you might have, particularly any programs that are using the internet. So a quick introduction of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be focusing on some of the main objectives of this MOOC on risk, security, and well-being. Essentially, we're going to be looking at sort of the basics of personal safety, well-being, and security risk management, given that all of these are sort of interconnected in many different ways in terms of how we think about our safety and security in the humanitarian field. The main goals for this webinar today are in a way to build on some of the things that we've been talking about in the discussions, essentially those week 1 to week 3. And on that note, just want to really thank everybody for their participation, and particularly those of you who've been sharing experiences and also interacting with each other. It's the real benefit of this type of training, of this type of learning, is to be able to interact with our peers and to gain sort of different insights from different perspectives. So thanks again for that. It's been really fantastic over the last few weeks. In addition to that, one of the things that we're going to deal with today in a bit more detail is we're going to talk a tiny bit about what I'd like to call the humanitarian operating space. A bit more of that in a little moment. And also go into a bit more depth on 2 or 3 issues that we've been talking about in particularly week 1 and week 2, given that I think they're quite significant in terms of managing our safety and security. I think, particularly for those of you who are here live, it just makes sense. There's not that many of us, so I think it just makes perfect sense for you guys to raise any questions, any issues that you might want to deal with. Just put them up on the chat and we'll deal with them as and when they come up. There's going to be sort of a more structured question and answer period sort of halfway through and at the end of this webinar. But I think it just makes sense if any issues come up, if any questions come up, just type them into the chat and we can deal with them as they come up. I think that's going to make for a more interactive, and more interesting learning experience. The slides just went a bit crazy there. So just a couple of words on myself. I've already introduced myself. I've already introduced myself at different points, but yeah, I think the main thing I want to stress at this point in this webinar is I came into the safety and security field essentially from my experience in field work. I worked in the field for about 15 years in many different contexts, and starting out as a humanitarian worker on the ground, and then gradually building up into sort of positions of greater responsibility, coordination responsibilities, at which point I started to focus more specifically on safety and security. And I'll discuss a little bit of that later on in this webinar. But that is essentially my background in terms of safety and security. It's definitely from the perspective of the user, if you get what I mean. So I think that it's just interesting to stress that at this stage. So coming back a little bit onto the week 1 discussions. The week 1 was very much focused on the humanitarian principles, and we discussed the humanitarian principles from a safety and security perspective. One of the things that came up many stages of our discussion forum was the fact that there might be a distinction between the terms safety and security. And this is actually quite essential to focus on this potential difference in terms of how we're thinking about our safety and security in the field. I recognize that not every language has got this nuance. English definitely does. And from what I know, quite a few other languages do have it. From what I understand, Swahili and Somali have got this clear distinction between these two terms, whereas many other languages do not have this distinction. They have just one all-encompassing term that covers safety and security. This is the case in most of the Latin-based languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. As I said, it's an important distinction to make. It raises quite a few fundamental questions. What are we actually trying to break up in terms of this definition between safety and security? I don't know if any of the people who are following the MOOC live have got any thoughts on this or remember sort of what we talked about on the MOOC. If so, just please feel free to type it in and try to make this a little bit more interactive. There are definitely some understandings, some perceptions that we have of both of these terms, and generally safety does seem to be a softer term. It seems to be more personal focused, and also does seem to cover a lot of what we might consider well-being issues. Having said that, that is not the distinction that we're playing with here. And interestingly, it's a distinction that you will often hear in sort of public places when they're making announcements. Very often, the announcements will focus either on safety or on security, or sometimes on both. The difference, therefore, is one that the way that we think about it depends essentially on whether there is intentionality. If there is no intentionality to cause harm in any way, then we would think about this threat as a safety threat. On the other hand, if there were to be an intentionality behind that threat, then we would think of it as a security threat. Crucially, for there to be a security threat, therefore, there has to be, almost by definition, another human being. And this is the crucial step, particularly when we're thinking about the security in our field as humanitarian workers. If we take the premise that a security threat involves other human beings, then we have to bring into this thought process what other people are looking into us, what other people are seeing when they see us. Ultimately, a lot of our security will depend on those perceptions. And here's where the humanitarian principles become so significant. The humanitarian principles, as we saw, are an element that puts us apart from many other groups. The values of humanitarianism in themselves are generally very positive, very humanist in their focus, and therefore that can put us in a relatively positive space as opposed to other stakeholders that might be present in the area. And crucially, as we also talked about, this adherence, these humanitarian principles, the fact that they're well known in different contexts, are the basis of this notion of acceptance. Acceptance is, by default, I'd say, the main security strategy that we have as humanitarian workers. And it also applies to aid and development workers. Most, if not all, organizations will have, if they have a structured security framework and a structured security policy, at some point in that policy, they will probably state, and very often in bold and underlined, that acceptance is their main security strategy. What do we mean by this acceptance? Crucially, what we are trying to identify, what we're trying to define, is the situation whereby we are accepted. And this acceptance has many levels. We have to be accepted, obviously, by the state structures, by the administrative, legal structures of the country, be this for national and for international organizations. And then ultimately, we have to be accepted in the communities where we are delivering our work. This acceptance should come with some level of benevolence, some level of goodwill, which is going to make it safer and more secure for us to operate. Communities will not be interested or willing to cause us harm because they accept our presence. Similarly, if there were to be potential threats brewing in the area, communities might take it upon themselves to actually let us know about this, to actually warn us. So this acceptance can be, in a way, both active and a bit more passive, but crucially, that is what is forming our starting point from a security perspective, and also for a safety perspective, because obviously the assistance that can be provided to us in case of an accident, in case of an unintentional threat, is also crucially going to be based on that acceptance that we have. Following on from this idea of perception and following on from this idea of acceptance, one of the things that I wanted to discuss a little bit today is precisely this understanding of what our starting point is. Very often, as humanitarian workers, we will be working in relatively remote contexts where it would not be realistic to expect that we will have massive amounts of organizational support at every level, from an operational, but often also from a safety and security perspective. This means that the personal security, personal safety side of things is crucial. And if, once again, we work on this assumption that security threats are intentional, then we also have to start thinking very carefully about who we are in any given context. The who we are is going to be unique and time and context driven for every single one of us. There are many different components that will shape this, some of which will be visible to the people that we're interacting with. It could be age, it could be gender, it could be race or ethnicity, in some cases even religion, are things that will be immediately visible. And these things will be, in a way, shaping our initial safety and security starting point. Obviously, to all of this, we have to add the organizational aspect of things, because obviously our acceptance is going to be built largely around that as well. But all of the individual components, be they visible or invisible, such as potentially our values, potentially our stressors, our mental health, for example, our tolerance or acceptance of risk, all of these things with our background, our own personal histories, will shape that starting point. And it makes sense to have a little bit of introspection, a little bit of self-thought regarding who we are in that given context, because that will be our starting point. It is from that point on that we will then be able to start thinking about threats. We'll be able to then start assessing threats, risks, etc. But crucially, it will always be based around the who we are in that context. I stress the context because obviously it will depend on the context. Some contexts can be more dynamic than others. And crucially, the moment we move from one area to another, it could be from one area of a town to another, or from one village to another, potentially that context is changing. And therefore, potentially who we are in that context is also shifting. And it is important to keep a track of all of that. I'll come back to the other two main security strategies in a moment. Another point that I wanted to look into, and it builds on from what I've been saying before, is to have a quick look at some statistics. Obviously, statistics have got the value that they have, and in our sector, we're not precisely very good at reporting incidents, although this has been improving over time. But I think this graph here is quite telling in terms of the evolution in our sector. If we chart the number of security incidents, and there I stress it's security incidents, therefore they're intentional attacks, the absolute numbers over time have increased. I've just limited the chart here to 2003, but if we went further back to 1997, which is when people started to compile data on this, the image is quite clear. There are a larger amount of incidents and a larger amount of victims per year in our sector. Now, this can be due to many different things. I mentioned it before, reporting has improved, so this is a factor to be taken into account. And also, crucially, the number of people who are working in our sector has also improved, has also risen over time. So this could explain also in absolute numbers. Having said that, the actual rate of attack has risen over time. So in proportion to the absolute number, the actual rate of incidents per year has increased. And an interesting and perhaps a sobering reflection on this as well is to take into account that the numbers of national and internationals and how they are affected are different. In absolute terms, around 86% of all incidents affect national staff. National staff, be they working for an international organization or national staff working for a national organization. So over 86% of incidents affect that particular group in our sector, leaving international aid workers, development, humanitarian workers at just around 14% of all total incidents and victims. Interestingly, however, the rate of attacks, the rate of incidents, is higher for internationals than for nationals. This would indicate that there is still some more specific targeting of internationals in some contexts. It doesn't actually reach double, but it's a significantly larger percentage of internationals that are being targeted. If we then try to look at how this looks from a geographical perspective, there might be or there might not be surprises here, but essentially Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria accumulate the largest amounts of incidents over the years. Incidentally, for those of you who might be interested, all of this data comes from a public and free database called the Aid Worker Security Database, which is quite an interesting resource to look into in terms of their breakdown of incidents per country and also per different types of incidents. However, as I stressed, these are security incidents. So ultimately, these are incidents where there is some level of targeting against aid, humanitarian, and development workers. This is not a database that includes accidents. Crucially, road traffic accidents are not included here. I don't know if there are any questions on any of this before I move on to other issues that I wanted to address. So I'm going to move on very briefly to talk a little bit about the 3 key security strategies that we have in the sector. As we mentioned earlier on, the main strategy is acceptance. This goodwill of the people that we're working with, this goodwill of the people who are around us, is one of the crucial aspects for our security. And interestingly, if we look back and we think back to the graph I showed you earlier on, where there was a rising number of incidents over time, to a certain extent, this might also be due, in some particular context, to a certain erosion of this acceptance. This notion of acceptance is very much built around the foundational humanitarian principles that we saw in week 1. However, in some contexts, organizations have had to make compromises in terms of their acceptance. They, in some cases, have had to negotiate access in order to be able to deliver the aid and support that they are mandated to deliver. As conflicts become more and more complex and conflicts involve greater amounts of stakeholders, greater amount of parties, it's almost inevitable that the moment some negotiation is taken into account in order to be able to further our work, this might be seen negatively by other stakeholders. So to a certain extent, in some contexts, what we are seeing is a very strong erosion of this core acceptance of humanitarian aid and development workers, to the extent that in many contexts now, it's almost impossible to talk about acceptance in this sense. And rather what we are talking about is a slightly more diluted version of tolerance. Our presence is tolerated, and that is a far cry from sort of this bubble of acceptance that was the basis of our safety and security. The other 2 main strategies, and once again, these are common to essentially all aid, humanitarian, and development organizations, And incidentally, because there's some participants who are from that field as well, this is also true for researchers, university researchers as well. The other two main strategies to think about are protection and deterrence. By protection, we mean anything that poses a barrier or impedes that people might be able to cause us harm or to threaten us. So typically we'd be talking about walls, we'd be talking about bars on windows, that kind of component. This is very different from the notion of deterrence. The moment we start thinking about deterrence, what we're ultimately doing is establishing that if anybody would like to try to harm us in any way, we can harm them back. Okay, we are putting a counter threat to any potential threat. Very typically, in some contexts, this will take the form of some form of armed protection, be it in road movements, be it armed guards at office entrances. The point that I think is really important to bear in mind is that the more protection and more crucially, the more deterrence options we go for, the more limited is our ability to work on acceptance. The moment we put a wall in front of people, we are limiting our capacity to interact with them. We're putting a barrier. And this barrier is going to affect our acceptance. And the same for deterrence. If we turn up to operate with armed guards, it's very unlikely that we'll be able to establish the same level of acceptance. Whereas I've been talking about these things from an organizational perspective, I believe very firmly that as aid, humanitarian, and development workers, these three components are also crucial to our personal safety and security. When I've been working in the field, I've been very conscious of the fact that my main protection, my main security and safety barrier, so to speak, has been my level of acceptance, has been my interaction with other human beings. Trying to establish that goodwill, trying to monitor it to a certain extent, I have found to be the most powerful way to operate in a safe and a secure manner. So I do think that it's very important for this to be stressed, to be focused on. If there are no questions, I'm going to have a look at the chat. I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects that we looked into in week 2. So essentially in week 2, we built upon a little bit these foundational components of our safety and security. So an understanding of who we are, an understanding of these notions of acceptance, protection, deterrence, and of the overarching humanitarian principles and how this feeds into our safety and security. In week 2, we essentially looked at, as some participants pointed out, sort of the before, the during, and the after to a certain extent. I'll break it down in this case into sort of planning and preparation and situational awareness. In terms of planning and preparation, once again, starting from that crucial initial assessment of who we are in that context, we then have to incorporate aspects and understanding of the context we are operating in. And this will include political, social, economic, conflict dynamics, infrastructure, as well as our own organizational mandate, our own organizational perception in the area. This is going to help us fully understand more or less the area, the context that we are operating in. On that note, and before moving on to the risk assessment and mitigation and some of the aspects of situational awareness, one thing that I think is quite interesting is to reflect on where potentially we are at greater risk. I have here on the screen a series of locations that are essentially common to most forms of humanitarian aid development work: home, office compound, project site, other public location, road, and custody. And I'd like you all, and also those who will be viewing this later, to think about where they think that they are more likely to suffer an incident of any kind. Now, obviously, this brings in the safety and security divide. We can think of places where our safety might be compromised. And in this case, probably what we will be thinking about is road traffic accidents. Road traffic accidents are generally understood to be the main source of concern. Yes, as Katja says, thank you for that. So road, in terms of safety, in terms of accidents, are now generally understood to be the main source of concern, the main location where incidents and fatalities occur to aid development and humanitarian workers. Having said that, let's also think about the security side of things. So thinking about the targeting and thinking about these same locations and trying to see where we think we might be more at risk. So have a quick think. Home, office compound, project site, or other public location, road or custody, in terms of our security, so in terms of targeted attacks, targeted threats, where might be the most likely place to suffer an incident? I take it you've given it a bit of a think, so let's have a look at some of the data on this. Let's see. So Katja is suggesting road and public locations. I mean, other public location obviously is the broadest. It encompasses pretty much everywhere other than those limited options that we have there. Jonas, hi there, is suggesting home. Obviously, that could be especially relevant in some particular context. What I'm going to show you now is a global overview of the situation. Contextually, in different areas, there might be slight variations on this. Having said that, the main one is essentially the same in every single context. So once again, this is from the Aid Worker Security Database and is looking at location of attacks between 1997 and 2017. So in terms of the data that we do have regarding targeted attacks, so security incidents, the road is, as in the case of safety, the main area of concern. Historically, year by year, it's generally slightly over or slightly under 50%, but it still amounts for around 50% of all targeted attacks. So both in terms of our safety, so accidents, but also in terms of targeted concerns, security concerns, road has to be a main focus of our attention when we're thinking about a threat. The other options are generally quite even in terms of their spread, although in the last few years, other public location has been creeping forward a little bit. As I say, there are country and regional variations to this, but road is by far and throughout most contexts the largest source of concern in this area. The reason I'm showing this is because when we are going through sort of a structured process, so we've looked into who we are, we've looked into the context, we see how that is panning out. The next thing we need to do, as was stressed in the week 2 discussion forums by many of you, is to start thinking about risk assessment. Now, a lot of you might have positive or negative experiences with risk assessments that you have to do for projects or for work or for travel authorization, which are usually Excel-based and very often are then sort of a copy and paste exercise. Now, this is not essentially what I want to talk about here. What I think is important from a personal safety and security perspective is the thought process of a risk assessment. So regardless of whether we actually then write it down or not, but thinking through the different stages of a risk assessment is actually quite a powerful tool. Just see the comment that's come in. So Alexander is mentioning that in the Ukrainian context, the main risks are direct fire, indirect fire, landmines, UXO, so unexploded ordnance, are at project sites, which are located close to the line of contact. So indeed, as I said, contextually in different areas, in different countries, there can be variations in how these statistics pan out. But globally, this is the status that we have at the moment. So as I was saying, in terms of the risk assessment thought process, once we identify who we are and the context, the next thing that makes sense to do is to try to establish what are the things that we're concerned about. Ultimately, what are the threats? What are the things that we are afraid of? What are the things that we believe could harm us or hurt us? This would be what we would refer to perhaps as threats, identifying threats. A lot of these threats will be pretty much universal. So for example, road traffic accidents, that would be a pretty universal threat to factor in. Issues such as terrorism, for example, as well. Nowadays, it would be very difficult in most contexts to completely factor that out. It would be a threat that we might have to consider. Similarly, sexual violence would also be a pretty universal threat that we'd have to look into. Basic criminality would be another pretty universal threat to look into. All of these things have got the potential to cause us harm and therefore are sources of concern. They will vary from context to context. The way that we would then start thinking about it once we've identified the threats is to try to look into the likelihood and the impact of them happening. So the likelihood of them happening to us in that context at that particular time, and based on the type of work that we're going to do. If we're trying to do it in a more formal way, we can put a scale to it. If we're just thinking it through, then just basically trying to identify our level of concern would make sense. The next step is to think about the impact. What impact could that threat that I am considering have on me if it were to occur? Once again, if we're doing it for ourselves, we can think of how we factor that in, how we assess the different potential options. But ultimately, we will then have some understanding of the threats that we're concerned about, their potential likelihood, and their potential impact upon us. In a weird way, the more specific we are, generally the easier it is to try to then break it down. So for example, in the case of terrorism, it might make sense to break it down into different modalities, different specific ways that terrorism could harm us. Be it an active shooter, be it an explosion, be it kidnapping, all of those would be slightly different modalities within that sort of more general category. If we're doing a risk assessment in sort of a more formal way, it would look something like this. We would have a threat. We would then try to assess the likelihood. If it's in a formal way, we'd try to give it a score between 1 to 5, and then an impact. Also, we'd give it a score between 1 to 5. The actual risk is therefore the multiplication of likelihood and impact. If we were to go for this type of scale, the lowest potential risk would be 1 and the highest would be 25. This whole thought process is valuable in the sense that we can then somehow try to identify which threats are more of a concern because of the risk that they entail. It's then quite useful to start thinking a little bit about ourselves and about sort of our areas of comfort. If we're doing it in this numeric way, we can sort of establish a threshold, be it 15 or 20 or 22, etc., beyond which we are significantly uncomfortable. Ultimately, the whole purpose of this exercise is to then start thinking about mitigation. What can we do to make things better? If we have carried out this thought process in this way, one of the advantages is that we can then start thinking about mitigation for likelihood and for impact separately. And we tend to be a lot more creative and a lot more inspired if we break it down in that way, as opposed to just grouping them together into just risk or threat. There are things that we might be able to do that could reduce the likelihood in the same way that there are things that we can do that can reduce the impact. So very typically, very classically, we can think about, in the case of road safety, having a good vehicle, a good driver, could reduce the likelihood, potentially, whereas having a seatbelt and wearing it could reduce the impact. The whole purpose being to think about as many mitigation measures for as many of the threats that we have identified, and then actually carrying them out. This is going to contribute to our safety and security. in many ways, just thinking things through in this way could have a positive impact. No pun intended, but could have a positive repercussion on our safety and security. Actually carrying out the mitigation that we've thought of is going to be even better. All of this are things that we can do in sort of the planning and preparation stage. The next stage, as we talked about in the discussion forum, is thinking about the during. And in this case, some issues such as situational awareness, or being aware of our environment, trying to understand different things that are happening into our environment, trying to understand the context well enough to be able to interpret things that are happening in the best way possible, will be quite significant. Very often, in some contexts, we might not have that initial knowledge of the area, in which case we will have to rely on sort of more basic instincts. As I said before, by definition, security threats are intentional, therefore they are based on other human beings. And ultimately, most forms of human aggression are quite common around the world. Therefore, whatever instincts we might have, whatever feelings that something might not be right that we might have, crucially, even though we don't know the context that well, we should still think it through. The worst thing we can do in any situation is, if we're feeling slightly that something is not quite right, that something is slightly wrong, is completely discarding that. We should at least give it a little moment to think things through. Why am I feeling that something is not right? This is a mnemonic that I introduced in the discussion forum at some point, READE. So we recognize that something might not be right, and this can be intellectual, or it can be sort of hair standing on end, or a gut feeling, literally. And then we assess it, we evaluate. That's the E. So recognize and then evaluate. We can evaluate by looking, by listening, by asking people, and all of this is going to help us interpret whatever has triggered that feeling. It'll then be up to us to act. Either we are unconcerned and we continue, or then we will try to either avoid the situation, diffuse it in as much as it affects us, or ultimately exit. And that is the A, avoid, D, diffuse, E, exit of the READE mnemonic. One last thing to think about in terms of our management of security situations is to recognize, and some of the things that we've looked at in week 3 have got some bearing on this, but to recognize that when we are in situations of high stress, we will most likely not be acting in a purely intellectual way. We will be acting at a more instinctive level. And this is generally understood to be our limbic system that is operating. So deep within our brain, we have got the limbic system, which is responsible for sort of instinctive evolutionary responses, such as fight, flight, freeze, and appease. And these things are universal. Everybody in any given high stress situation is most likely going to be initially acting on a purely reactive level based on their limbic response, be it fight, flight, freeze, or appease. This is positive in many ways. It's helped our species survive over many, many centuries. However, in terms of thinking about our security, the sooner we get back into control of that situation, the better. So, for example, just in case this is not completely clear, if we feel that we are in danger and our response is a flight response, so running away, we will just be running away. Our limbic system will take hold of us and it will just run. It will not necessarily be thinking about other things. It will be sort of in a sort of tunnel vision, just running straight, and not necessarily factoring in important things, such as maybe there are vehicles crossing the road. If it's in a closed environment, maybe it's not thinking about what might be behind the door. So that's why it's important to try to regain control over those situations from a more conscious level in order to be able to be thinking about options. Because in security situations, we cannot be prescriptive about what we can do. I mean, every situation will be different. But inevitably, the best thing that we can always have is options, and the more options possible. So some options will close down options, and some options will open up other options. But this is only possible if we're thinking things through and not just reacting to the situation. So crucially, and to round this up a tiny bit, this sort of situational awareness and sort of this sort of management potentially of how we're reacting in a situation can crucially give us the space to have luck. Ultimately, and it might be strange to say this in this context, given what we're looking at on this MOOC, in a lot of security situations and a lot of safety issues, luck will be an important factor. Having said that, we need to do everything we can to allow luck to happen. If we feel that something is not right and we still go ahead without giving it much thought, we're not giving space for that luck to happen. So taking advantage of those moments to allow luck to happen is really, really significant in terms of our safety and our security. Before we move on to some considerations on week 2 and week 3, are there any thoughts or questions on any of all of this that I've been talking about? Okay, so I'll continue briefly, talking a little bit about some issues regarding week 3. I'm actually very happy that in this MOOC we are focusing on stress and field resilience and sort of mental health in general. It's one of the areas where, despite the significant improvements in our sector in terms of how we're managing safety, security, and well-being, it's one of the areas where we are still, let's say, work in progress. And there are a lot of concerns from the stress and field resilience aspect of things. As we've been discussing on this week's discussion forum, the type of work that we do, humanitarian aid and development, depending on the contexts, can be very stressful, be it in terms of vicarious trauma, because we're dealing with people who have gone through very horrific experiences, be it because of the conditions that we're working under, be it because of the immediacy, the urgency of what we have to do. All of this does create sort of a potential for a lot of stress, a lot of tension, and ultimately for the degeneration of this into mental health concerns. It's therefore really important that in the same way that we are now more or less aware of the things that we need to do to keep physically healthy, such as eating well, sleeping well, potentially doing some exercise, etc., that we also think about the things that we need to do in order to remain in the best possible mental situation regarding the areas that we're working in. Trying to identify the things that stress us out. At one point, I started to make a list for myself, trying to identify the things that were making me a bit more stressed, and also trying to identify within sort of different symptoms that I might be showing, indications of when I might be going through a bit of a threshold. Obviously, some level of stress is positive. It's what's going to push us to work. But if it starts going beyond what is healthy for us, and once again, that'll depend on us and on many other factors of our life, be it our family situations, be it our financial concerns, etc. All of this will play a part. But trying to identify sort of the thresholds beyond which we are no longer operating in a normal way can be really important. And then trying to think of the things that help us cope, the things that we can do to try to get out of any sort of negative spirals we might be working in. For me personally, one of the things that I always found challenging in terms of field work was the remoteness from friends, family, loved ones, not having those sort of support mechanisms, those mechanisms which allow us to vent, to let steam out. I always found that to be quite difficult. And fact, in terms of actually thinking about the different stressors, for me, one of the things that I started to identify as an early signal that I was getting beyond my normal stress was when I was no longer reaching out, when I was no longer trying to keep in contact with friends and family. When I realized that I was not replying to emails and all that, that's when that became one of my signals in terms of, okay, I probably need to stop a little bit here because this is not normal, this is not healthy. So trying to think about sort of what are the things that can make us stressed, what are the symptoms that we might show, potentially different thresholds, and then thinking about different coping mechanisms can be really important. To this end, a colleague that we work with quite a lot called Fiona Dunkley, she is a clinical therapist who has got a very strong background in humanitarian work, and is somebody we work with quite a lot in terms of thinking about sort of the mental health aspects. Has created sort of this, she calls it a field resilience toolkit based around the mnemonic respect, which is now on screen. So yeah, Katja, thank you for that. Yeah, if we do not take care of ourselves first, we will threaten the well-being of others. That's a very good point. And it also ties in, Katja, to the whole issue of empathy. As we mentioned in the first week, I mean, empathy is a really powerful tool in terms of our acceptance, in terms of our safety and security, and also in terms of working and interacting with others. Once that empathy starts to erode, then potentially we are doing ourselves and the people we're working with harm, and it's also one of the aspects to look into. So coming back a little bit to this field resilience toolkit, some of it might be quite intuitive, things like relaxation, things like social aspects, trying to have connection with people. Exercise as well can be quite obvious. One that I think is important, at least from my personal perspective, is the education side, trying to actually understand how we work, trying to understand what triggers us is, I think, quite important. And another one that I found very useful in my experience in the field is creativity. Regardless of where we are, regardless of how limited the resources that we have, the ability to create something, be it a drawing, be it just a little pile of something, or just modeling something, the ability to actually create something is I think really powerful. As human beings, it's one of the great things we have. We can create things, we can think of something, we can conceptualize it, and then we can actually do it with our hands. And that, I think, is quite a good grounding exercise in terms of trying to get out of a situation of accelerating stress. That, I think, is something that's quite interesting. So I'll just make a couple of points regarding week 4, because obviously we're not there yet, but just as this is already in the webinar, I thought it made sense to make a few references to it. In week 4, we're going to look at a series of different components based around perhaps the idea of professionalism, but obviously that also touches on issues of leadership and team dynamics. And ultimately, it takes us back to our humanitarian principles. Our acceptance of who we are in any given context will be determined in many ways by our professionalism. And maybe opening up a little tangent, as was mentioned by several of you on the discussion forum, this lack of distinction very often, the lack of limits between professional life and personal life, is often one of the big challenges of humanitarian aid and development work. The fact that we are essentially bound by our humanitarian principles, even beyond working hours, because people are looking at us, people are understanding us, people are reading into us, and ultimately that professionalism, that respect for these humanitarian principles is something that if we are exhibiting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is going to increase potentially our level of acceptance. Any deviations in our personal life will inevitably, because of the context, because of the limited surroundings that we're operating in have an impact on how people are perceiving us and ultimately on our acceptance. And that is also one of the things that are quite trying about this type of work, which is perhaps a bit different to other professions. A lot of the different stress factors of humanitarian aid and development work we can find in other occupations. Perhaps the buildup of all these different components is quite unique, but ultimately this lack of distinction between the professional and the personal in some context is also a relatively unique aspect that has to be factored in. So just to conclude before we have some questions, so some of the key points of today's webinar, but also of the course in itself. Beyond the duty of care that organizations have for our safety and security, ultimately, it is a personal responsibility that we have for ourselves. There are collective components as well. We are working with other people, be it part of our organization, be it beneficiaries, be it colleagues from other organizations. So there are collective components, but ultimately it's a very, very personal thing. As a lot of you have mentioned in the discussion forum, safety and security should come first. We should put the oxygen mask on ourselves before we help others. And this is very important, without losing track of the fact that there are other people as well. I mean, humanity is such a core component of what we do in terms of humanitarian principles. From the planning, preparation, context analysis, risk assessment, some of these are organizational framework tools, but I believe that the thought process, the structure behind thinking of security in that way is relevant from a personal level. So the more we understand who we are in that context, the more we think about potential threats, without being paranoid, that's not the point, but the more we think about potential threats and how we can mitigate against them, the more safer and secure we will be. And a lot of times mitigation is not something that is expensive or something that requires a lot of effort or investment on our behalf. Very often it's just a matter of setting rules for ourselves. I will not do this, or I will do this. A lot of times it can be that kind of thing, which can be a mitigation measure, which can be very powerful. Within different situations, situational awareness, being aware of where we are, being open to the different inputs that we are receiving, trying to know the context well enough to be able to understand and interpret it in the best possible way. And if things are happening, then being very mindful of our instinctive responses to it, and always trying to keep in mind this idea of options. The more options we have, the better, and options that open options are always going to be better. Ultimately, and in a way, it comes back to the sort of before, during, and after breakdown. Keeping track on our physical and mental well-being is really, really significant over time. And ultimately, and this was sort of the point that I made earlier on, recognizing that safety, security, and well-being are essential to deliver our work. And to be honest, this is, in my personal experience, what led me to where I am today. When I started out working in the field 15 years ago, I was not that keen on all these security components, all the security administration, all of the sort of risk assessments that had to be done, all the protocols, etc. I often found it very cumbersome, and I often thought that it was impeding me from actually doing my work. At one point, I actually realized that without all of that, there was just no way that I would be able to do the work that I love to do. Without that minimal level of safety, security, and well-being, without respecting some of these things, without taking that personal responsibility for it, there was just no way that any organization would let me do the work that I wanted to do in the way that I wanted to do it. So that enabling aspect of safety, security, and well-being is actually what has led me to work actively in this field. That understanding that without it, we cannot actually do the work that we want to do. Any last comments or questions? I realize that I've been speaking a lot to you. be very happy to respond to any questions that you might have in the last few minutes that we have. For those of you who are going to be watching the recording, if there are any questions or thoughts, then please just put them into potentially the social forum, and I'll be more than happy to respond to them. If there are no questions, and I mean, for those of you in the chat, you've still got time. I just want to move on to, oh, there's one comment here. Please send me the recording. Yes, they will be sending a link to the recording to all participants who attended, and also to all those who were unable to attend today. If you have any further questions, those of you who are listening to me live, then just send them in. Katya, thank you for being present, Katya. So yeah, please do send any further questions. I'll just move on to another couple of resource slides that might be useful for everyone. So here are a list of relevant webinars, recordings that are available on Kaya. Obviously, you don't need to write them down at the moment. They will be made available in the recording, and I can include them onto the social forum potentially later on today. These are all very interesting webinars, in this case focusing on some of the key humanitarian principles. Last but not least, just a quick reminder of some of the requirements and prerequisites to obtain the certificate at the end of the course. Peter, no worries, thank you. So yeah, these are sort of the requirements, just a bit of a reminder to successfully complete all the Explore sections, to participate weekly in the forum, and to submit your weekly reflection in the forum as well, which thankfully I think most of you have been doing quite regularly. And last reminder of the certificate criteria in terms of completing the Explore, Reflect and Share activities for week 1, week 2, week 3 and week 4. So last few seconds in case there's any live questions. And if not, just thank you all who were able to attend live, and remotely thank all of those who will be watching the recording. It's been a really great experience so far on this MOOC, and I do hope that we enjoyed the last few weeks, or the last week and a half together. Thank you very much, Alexander, as well. So if there's no further comments, questions, then do please send any additional ones through the social forum. And thank you all ever so much for attending, and I wish you all a fantastic rest to the morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you very much.